The bell of St. Michael's rang with a dull, iron weight, its sound flattening across the narrow streets of Milwaukee's Third Ward. The morning fog carried the smell of wet coal and bread left too long in the oven. A cluster of children raced along the slick stones, their laughter striking the air in bright cracks before dissolving again into silence. And then there was Violet. She wasn't running with them. She stood alone in the shadow of the church gate, her hands pressed flat against the black iron bars as though the metal could tell her something if she held still long enough. Her lips moved without sound, rehearsing words no one had taught her. Behind the gate, Father O'Brien watched from the rectory window. He saw the way the girl's eyes stayed fixed on nothing, on something beyond the smoke, beyond the walls, beyond even the sky. He had heard her gifts spoken about in the parish, though the word gift was said with the caution one might reserve for curses. People whispered that she remembered things too well, that she repeated things without knowing, that she carried words as if they were stones sewn into her coat. The door to the church swung open, and men filed in for early confession before work at the brewery. Their boots left tracks of ash and mud on the wooden steps. Violet followed them quietly, as though pulled by invisible string. She was not asked to enter. She simply did. The confessional stood in half-shadow, its carved oak doors flanking a narrow kneeler. The smell of wax and pine lingered, heavy, almost sweet. Father O'Brien entered from the priest's side. Violet slipped into the alcove where she was meant to sit unseen. The arrangement had been his compromise with the German families. Let the girl translate, they had insisted, else their sins be misunderstood in a foreign tongue. But O'Brien knew the danger. A child bearing secrets not meant for mortal ears. The first man crossed himself and lowered his head. His voice slid into German, deep, raspy, ashamed. Violet's mouth began to move instantly, English spilling from her lips with unnatural precision. She did not falter, not once. Even the tremor of the man's pauses, when his breath shook, when he struggled to continue, she carried into her translation like she was shadowing his very lungs. The confession was short, about a lie told to a wife. Harmless. O'Brien gave penance, the man departed. But Violet remained. Then came the next, and the next. The air thickened with details. A stolen payroll ledger, a hand that had struck harder than intended, a locked door where someone had screamed. Violet spoke it all, her voice flat, steady, like a knife sliding through fabric. But what unsettled Father O'Brien most wasn't her accuracy. It was her eyes. They stayed wide open as she translated, unfocused, as though she weren't even in the church, but somewhere else entirely, walking through the rooms being described, watching the flames on the stairwell, hearing the muffled sob behind a locked door. She wasn't simply repeating. She was reliving. When the last man left, Violet stayed kneeling. She whispered a string of German words softly, words that hadn't been spoken aloud by anyone that morning. Father O'Brien stiffened. He hadn't heard those words. He hadn't asked her to translate them. They had come from her memory, unbidden, as if she were still in yesterday's confessions or the week before. Violet, he said gently, his voice careful, priestly. Do you know what you're saying? She looked at him for the first time that morning. Her pupils were wide, reflecting the flicker of the votive candles. I can't forget, Father, she said. It stays. He swallowed. The air between them seemed to tighten. From outside came the sudden thunder of a wagon on cobblestones. A man's laugh cut the silence, rough, booming. Hans Richter. His voice carried even through stone, commanding, self-assured. Violet flinched as if struck, her gaze darting to the floor. Father O'Brien noticed. Richter was a name that hovered over the ward like smoke. He owned warehouses, taverns, wagons, men. He was the one neighbors petitioned when they needed favors, the one they feared crossing when debts went unpaid. His shadow stretched into the church as easily as it did into the taverns. O'Brien leaned forward. Has Herr Richter spoken to you, Violet? Her mouth pressed shut. She shook her head, but O'Brien wasn't convinced. The girl carried too much, more than a child should. The following Sunday, during Mass, Violet sat in the second pew, hands folded neatly. But she wasn't listening to the hymn. Her lips moved again, silently. Words, names, sentences, the rhythm of secrets that refused to stay buried. Beside her, Mrs. Zimmerman turned pale. She recognized one of the names Violet mouthed. a name tied to a bakery down on Water Street. A man who had come from Hamburg with a reputation that was supposed to have been left behind. The older woman tugged at her husband's sleeve. Her face was tight, her eyes darting toward the altar where Father O'Brien lifted the chalice. By the end of that week, whispers began to stir across the ward. Quiet, suspicious whispers. The kind that grow teeth. And Violet, still a child, still so small her shoes barely scuffed the ground when she sat on the pew, became their center. Snow fell in thin, bitter threads that winter, weaving itself across rooftops and pooling in the narrow gutters of Milwaukee's Third Ward. The streets seemed quieter now, as if the ward itself was listening for something it couldn't quite name. And in the middle of that hush, Violet carried the weight of other people's words. She was only 12, but her memory worked like iron hooks. Once something latched, it did not come loose. Phrases clung to her mind whole and unbroken. The scrape of a match beneath a tenement stairwell, the clatter of a coin passed to silence a witness, the sob of a girl locked in a cellar. They came uninvited, at odd moments, while she buttered bread or stitched the torn hem of her dress. Her mother thought she was daydreaming. Her father said she had a cleverness that would take her far. But Violet knew the truth. Her mind was a crowded place where other people's shadows lived. One evening, she sat at the small wooden table in their cramped room on Huron Street. The fire snapped low, barely warming the space. Greta, her mother, pressed linen against the washboard with red, raw hands, humming an old tune in German. Heinrich mended a barrel hoop in silence. Violet's lips moved before she realized it. A name slipped out, whispered like a prayer. Her mother froze. "What did you say, child?" Violet looked down, cheeks heating. She hadn't meant to speak. She hadn't meant for the name to leave the safe prison of her head. It was nothing, Mama. But it wasn't nothing. Greta knew the name. Everyone in the ward knew it. A baker, respected, pious enough in church. Heinrich gave Violet a sharp look, a look that meant be still. His barrel hoop bent under the sudden force of his hand. After that, meals grew quieter. Greta pressed harder at her washboard, as though scrubbing away her unease. Heinrich came home later, drinking first at the tavern before facing his daughter's strange, dangerous memory. Father O'Brien noticed the change too. He called Violet to the rectory one afternoon under the pretense of needing help with hymnals. The girl sat on the edge of a heavy oak chair, feet dangling, back rigid. She always sat that way now, tense, as if braced for something. "Do you understand the sacrament of confession?" O'Brien asked, pacing slowly. His Irish brogue softened his words, but his eyes were hard. "It is secret," Violet said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like reciting catechism. "Secret," O'Brien echoed. "Yes, between priest and penitent. Do you know what that means?" Her pale eyes flickered. "That I should not repeat it. And yet you do." Violet's small hands twisted in her lap. "I don't mean to. The words, they don't leave me. I hear them again, even when I don't want to." O'Brien stopped pacing. For a moment, he simply looked at her. She seemed smaller in the chair, shoulders curled in against the weight of her own gift. Not defiant, not malicious, simply unable to contain what poured into her. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. This was a burden no child should carry, yet it had been placed on her shoulders by necessity, by poverty, by the stubborn demands of the community. "Violet," he said quietly, "you must guard yourself. These words, they are dangerous. Do you understand?" She nodded, but O'Brien wasn't convinced. That same week, rumors began to ripple wider. Mrs. Zimmerman, stern and sharp-eyed, whispered to neighbors that Violet had spoken things no child should know. She spoke of Hamburg fires, of screams muffled behind walls. Wilhelm Zimmerman, her husband, urged caution, but curiosity burned hotter than caution in the cramped tenements of the ward. Men began to linger after Mass, glancing sideways at the girl who sat so still on the pew. Women pressed their children closer when she passed, as though memory itself were contagious. And then came Hans Richter. His presence filled the ward like smoke. He moved in and out of taverns, into the church vestibule, along the docks where men loaded barrels. Always with the same confident step, the same heavy coat, the same cold eyes. He was not an elected leader, yet everyone knew he made decisions that mattered more than any councilman's. Richter noticed the shift in the community, the murmurs, the sidelong looks. He noticed, too, that the center of those whispers was a child. One evening, he stepped into the rectory unannounced. The fire in O'Brien's study spat low light across Richter's broad shoulders. "You have a problem," Richter said flatly. Father O'Brien set down his pen. His gut tightened. "Do I?" "The girl," Richter continued, pouring himself a drink without asking. "She speaks what should not be spoken. That cannot continue." O'Brien's jaw clenched. "She is a child. She is a liability," Richter corrected. "Words have power, Father. Power to ruin men, to burn businesses, to undo families. Do you want that on your conscience?" The priest did not answer. Richter leaned closer, his breath carrying the sharp sting of whiskey. "Either you silence her, or I will." The words hung in the air, heavier than the toll of any bell. That night, Violet woke from a dream she could not name. She sat up in the small bed she shared with her younger brother, staring at the ceiling beams above. The room smelled of soap and damp wood. Outside, the snow muffled the world. Her lips moved again, unbidden. Names. Places. A rhythm of crimes she had never seen, but somehow lived through in memory. Her brother stirred, half asleep. "Vi, stop whispering," he muttered. But she couldn't stop. The words came like water through a cracked dam. By the following week, the ward buzzed with unease. A baker closed his shutters early. A carpenter vanished overnight. Mrs. Zimmerman swore she saw men moving in the alley behind Woolmer's old tavern, carrying sacks that clanked like chains. Father O'Brien filled his journals with notes, dates, details, names Violet spoke during her trances. Each entry weighed heavier on him, a secret within a secret. He was building a record that could save lives or destroy the parish entirely. And Violet herself grew quieter, thinner, as though the memories consumed more of her each day. She no longer laughed with the other girls or hummed while helping her mother. Her world had narrowed to whispers she couldn't control and eyes that followed her in the street. The ward was turning, slowly but unmistakably, and Hans Richter was watching. The night the dam truly broke began like any other. Snow drifted across the narrow lanes of the third ward, falling in fat, wet clumps that clung to boots and horses' manes. Windows glowed with dim oil lamps, their light blurred by frost. The Mueller household was quiet, save for the scrape of Heinrich's knife against the table as he trimmed a stave for the next day's barrels. Violet sat opposite him, needle in hand, trying to mend her brother's torn shirt. Her fingers moved slowly, clumsily. The thread slipped once, twice. Her mind was elsewhere, as it always was. Her lips began to move. At first it was a whisper, too faint to notice over the scrape of a knife. But then Greta, kneeling near the hearth, raised her head. The words were German, precise, sharp, unhesitating. Violet's eyes were unfocused, staring at nothing. In the tavern cellar, shackles fixed to beams, she cried for hours, but the door stayed locked. Greta dropped the cloth she was wringing. "Violet," she hissed, crossing herself. "Stop." But the girl's voice only grew clearer, stronger, carrying the rhythm of memory like a recitation. Money paid by Richter, 2 boys taken west, barrels hiding more than ale, Heinrich's knife stilled. His face blanched as though he had seen a ghost. He lunged forward and gripped his daughter's shoulders, shaking her gently. "Child, enough." Violet blinked, breath catching. It was as though she had just surfaced from deep water. Her eyes darted from her father to her mother, wide, frightened. "I didn't mean," she stammered. "It just comes." Silence thickened the room. Only the fire popped. Greta's hands trembled as she lifted the fallen cloth. Heinrich's jaw clenched hard enough to ache. He knew what those words meant. He had worked long enough in Richter's warehouses to know the whispers about what moved in and out of them after dark. This was no childish fantasy. This was truth. The truth did not stay confined to their 4 walls. 2 days later, Mrs. Zimmerman cornered Greta outside the pump. The older woman's voice was low, her eyes darting around to be sure no one else heard. "Your girl," she whispered. She spoke a name. "My neighbor's cousin. He heard her outside Massachusetts, said she named Johann Kellerman for what he did in Hamburg. Said it plain as day, with details only God could know." "Greta, how could she?" Greta denied it, but her voice shook. By evening, the rumor had rippled through half the ward. Men muttered over their mugs at Woolmer's tavern. Women whispered as they hung laundry in the frozen air. Children pointed at Violet when she passed, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. By Sunday, the pew around the Muellers sat conspicuously empty. Neighbors shifted away, crossing themselves when Violet's pale eyes lifted toward the altar. And Father O'Brien, delivering his sermon, could feel the congregation's gaze not on him, but on her. After Mass, he asked the family to remain. The church emptied slowly, boots thudding against stone, whispers trailing like smoke. When the last door closed, O'Brien turned to Heinrich and Greta. "She cannot continue," he said simply. Greta's face was drawn, hollow. Heinrich bristled. "The money." O'Brien's voice cracked, more from grief than anger. "You would risk her life for coins? Do you not hear what is happening around you? Men are frightened. Frightened men make dangerous choices." Greta began to weep softly. Heinrich looked away. Violet sat silently on the pew, her hands folded in her lap. She seemed smaller than her years, her braids limp against her shoulders. Yet her eyes, those strange, steady eyes, stayed fixed on the crucifix above the altar. Finally, she spoke. "It doesn't matter if I sit in the box or not. I still remember." Her voice was calm, almost resigned. It was the first time she had admitted it aloud. Her memory wasn't a job she could quit. It was part of her. O'Brien felt the weight of those words. The turning point was not whether she would continue in the confessional. It was whether she could survive carrying what she already knew. That night, O'Brien began to write in earnest. He filled pages of a leather-bound journal with Violet's recitations, each detail recorded with priestly precision. The scratch of his pen echoed long past midnight. He told himself he was preserving evidence, should the worst happen. But part of him knew. He was building a coffin of words, a weight too heavy for a girl to carry alone. When he finally set down his pen, the candle was nearly spent. He knelt before the crucifix in his study, his forehead pressed against clasped hands. "Lord," he whispered, "forgive me, for I do not know how to protect her." Meanwhile, Hans Richter was not praying. He stood in the back room of his warehouse, the air thick with smoke and the sharp stench of iron. Two of his men leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "She's a child," one muttered. "What can she do?" Richter's eyes narrowed. "Children talk. And when they talk, others listen. You think rumors die on their own? No. They spread. They rot foundations." He poured himself a measure of whiskey, hands steady. "If she repeats what she should not, men will ask questions about me. About us. That cannot be allowed." The other man shifted uneasily. "What do you want done?" Richter sipped slowly, savoring the burn. "Not yet. Let her speak. Let me hear how much she knows. Then we decide." His words were calm, but his gaze was cold steel. The next day, Violet walked past the bakery on Water Street. The snow had turned to slush, and her boots squelched as she stepped around puddles. The smell of yeast and scorched crust curled into the air. Without warning, her lips began to move again. 6 children, locked inside, fire set from the stairwell. Mrs. Zimmerman, standing nearby, froze. The blood drained from her face. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared at Violet as though she were staring at a ghost. The words had escaped too loudly this time. Others heard. By nightfall, the ward was ablaze with rumor, not of Violet's strange memory, but of murder, of crimes too monstrous to ignore. And Violet herself? She sat on her narrow bed, hands folded tightly, staring at the dark window pane. She whispered only to herself now, as if trying to keep the words locked inside. But the reflection in the glass looked back at her with an expression she did not recognize, part fear, part burden, part something older than any child should wear. The turning point had come. Violet was no longer just a translator of sins. She was a danger. The ward no longer looked at Violet as a child. When she walked the narrow lanes between the brewery and the river, neighbors lowered their voices or turned away altogether. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered prayers under their breath as if she were a curse that might be passed by proximity. Even children avoided her. Once, a boy she'd played marbles with spat near her feet and called her a witch. His mother dragged him inside before Greta could respond. Isolation grew heavier than the Milwaukee snow. Father O'Brien noticed the change most during Massachusetts. On Sundays, Violet sat beside her mother and father in the second pew, as she always had. Yet every week the space around the Muellers stretched wider, pews left empty in quiet protest. O'Brien's eyes flicked to her during the homily. She kept her head bowed, braids falling forward like curtains, lips moving faintly. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He knew. Afterward, in the sacristy, he confronted her gently. "What do you whisper, child?" Violet looked up at him, pale eyes clear but exhausted. "I try to pray, Father. But the other words come, too." "What words?" Her gaze drifted past him, as though she were seeing through the stone wall. "Names. Places. Things I cannot stop." O'Brien swallowed. There was no malice in her voice. Only weariness. "You must be careful," he said, softer now. "Not every ear should hear them." She tilted her head, as if puzzled. But isn't truth supposed to be heard? The question struck him like a blow. For a moment, he had no answer. Rumors grew claws. Mrs. Zimmerman pressed her husband to follow Violet's mutterings, to confirm them. Wilhelm did. One evening he slipped into the boarded-up tavern near the docks, the place Violet had once described in a trance. There, in the cellar, he found shackles bolted to beams and stains dark as dried rust. He came back pale, lips thin. He told no one but his wife. Yet secrets like those have a way of leaking. Soon others whispered of disappearances, of debts paid in more than coin, of barrels that smelled wrong when pried open. Richter's name began to attach itself to these murmurs. And Richter noticed. The priest's study grew colder that winter. Candles burned lower, their wax pooled in small oceans across his desk. Father O'Brien filled his journals with Violet's words. Each date, each name, each gruesome detail, she whispered when her mind wandered. But the more he wrote, the more he felt the crushing weight of his betrayal. The seal of confession was sacred in Violet. To break it was to sever his own priesthood. Yet to keep silent was to condemn a child to bear sins too poisonous for anyone, let alone a girl, to carry. One night he fell to his knees before the crucifix, shoulders shaking. "Lord, guide me," he whispered. "If I protect the seal, she will die. If I protect her, I betray you. Tell me which sin is greater." The silence of the room answered him. Only the wind howled faintly through the shutters. Meanwhile, Violet herself grew thinner, paler. She no longer played, no longer sang. She slept fitfully, muttering names even in dreams. Greta watched helplessly, wringing her hands until the skin cracked. Heinrich grew angrier, pacing the room, cursing the church for using his daughter, cursing the neighbors for turning against her. But Violet seemed oddly calm. One evening, as snow hissed against the window, she told her mother, "I don't think I'm meant to grow old." Greta gasped, clutching her daughter close. "Don't say such things." But Violet only pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, eyes open, distant. "The words won't leave me. Maybe they'll leave if I do." Greta sobbed quietly, rocking her as if Violet were still a small child. Richter made his move soon after. He appeared at the rectory unannounced, boots stamping snow into the floor, the smell of whiskey and tobacco clinging to his coat. "Father," he said smoothly, "we need to talk." O'Brien's gut tightened. "About the girl? About the danger she poses?" Richter's eyes were cold, calculating. "You're a man of God. You understand the value of silence. Communities fall apart when words run wild." O'Brien met his gaze. "She is a child. Innocent. Innocent." Richter barked a low laugh. "She names men who should not be named. She points to places better left buried. That is not innocence. It is poison. And poison must be cut out." The priest's hands curled into fists on his desk. "You would murder her." Richter's tone turned almost gentle. "I would protect the ward. You think you save her by keeping her here? You kill her slower. Let me deal with it cleanly." O'Brien's chest tightened. He wanted to shout, to denounce, to summon guards. But he knew Richter's reach ran deeper than law. Richter leaned forward, voice low. "You have one chance, Father. Send her away. Hide her, or I will ensure she never speaks again." With that, he turned and left, snow swirling in behind him before the door slammed shut. That night, O'Brien went to the Muellers. The family huddled close to the hearth, the room smelling of damp wool and fear. He explained in hushed tones what Richter had said, what danger pressed on them now. Heinrich's face hardened. "We leave, then, tonight." Greta clutched Violet tightly, trembling. "Where will we go?" "Chicago," O'Brien said. "I have contacts there. A parish that can shelter you until it is safe." Heinrich nodded once. Decision made. Violet sat silent through it all, her pale eyes distant. Finally, she whispered, "It won't matter. The words will follow me." O'Brien knelt before her, gripping her small hands. "Then let them follow into a place where you're safe. Please, child." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded faintly. Plans were set in whispers. Wilhelm Zimmermann agreed to load the Muellers into his wagon at dusk the next day, hidden beneath barrels bound for the depot. O'Brien would accompany them partway, then return to avoid suspicion. But as Violet lay in her bed that night, she stared at the ceiling beams, listening to the muffled sounds of the ward outside. Somewhere in the distance, laughter boomed, a sound she knew belonged to Richter. She whispered to the darkness, not sure if to herself or to God. "If I speak, they die. If I stay silent, I die." The words hung in the cold air, fragile as frost. And in that fragile silence, the world shifted. The stage was set. The climax was waiting. The night of their escape smelled of coal smoke and frozen iron. Snow fell in thin needles, cutting across the lamplight as Wilhelm Zimmermann's wagon rumbled over the cobblestones toward the depot. The barrels rattled in the back, and beneath them, Violet crouched with her mother, her father's broad arms sheltering them as though his weight alone could keep danger at bay. The city hummed with ordinary life, dockworkers heading home, vendors shuttering stalls. But in Violet's chest, everything felt like the moment before thunder. She whispered to herself without sound, lips moving against the dark wood of the barrel above her. Names, places, chains rattling in her memory. No matter how tightly she pressed her teeth, the words still pushed. Heinrich squeezed her shoulder. "Quiet, Main Mädchen. Just a little longer." She nodded, though both knew the words inside her had no leash. The depot loomed ahead, lanterns swinging from iron hooks, steam rising where engines hissed and breathed. Men shouted over the clang of coupling rods. Horses stamped nervously, their breath turning white. Wilhelm guided the wagon toward the shadows near the loading platform. "We wait for the signal," he muttered, glancing around. But before any signal came, the shadows moved. 3 figures detached themselves from the dark, boots crunching on frozen stone. In the center walked Hans Richter, his heavy coat flaring slightly in the wind, his face set in grim calm. 2 men flanked him, broad, silent, eyes hard as slate. Wilhelm's hands tightened on the reins. "Got him, Himmel." Heinrich pushed the barrels aside, emerging with his fists clenched. Greta clutched Violet tighter. Richter stopped before the wagon, surveying them with a cool, appraising gaze. "Going somewhere?" he asked, voice carrying over the noise of the station. Heinrich's chest heaved. "Leave us be, Hans. We want no trouble." Richter smiled faintly, a predator's smile. "Trouble follows words, Heinrich. And your daughter's mouth is nothing but trouble." Violet felt her mother's grip tighten until her fingers dug into her ribs. She wanted to bury her face in Greta's coat, to hide, but the words inside her pressed harder, like boiling water against thin glass. And then they spilled. "She said you took them," Violet blurted, voice high, trembling. "2 boys, gone west in barrels. You paid for it with blood money." The platform stilled. Workers who had been shouting fell silent. A few turned their heads. Richter's eyes flicked to them, then back to Violet. His jaw tightened. "Child," he said softly, "you don't know what you're saying." But Violet did know. The dam inside her cracked wide open. She scrambled from the wagon, words pouring from her like a flood. The cellar under Woolmer's tavern. Chains on the beams, stains on the floor. You locked them there. You let them die? And Johann Kellerman. The fire in Hamburg. 6 children burned. You knew you helped. Her voice rang out sharp and unrelenting, cutting through the hiss of the train, the mutter of the crowd. Each word was a blade, slicing away the silence that had protected Richter for years. Gasps rippled through the bystanders. A constable at the far end of the platform froze, staring. Richter's mask of calm cracked. His eyes flashed with something raw, rage, yes, but also fear. "Enough," he growled. He lunged forward, seizing Violet by the arm. She cried out as his grip crushed her bone-thin wrist. Heinrich roared, charging, but the 2 men intercepted him, grappling, fists slamming into flesh. Greta screamed, clawing at Richter's coat, only to be shoved aside. Wilhelm staggered, blood spilling from his mouth where a blow had landed. Violet twisted, kicking, her voice rising even louder. "You killed them. You kill anyone who speaks. You." Richter's hand clamped over her mouth, but it was too late. The words were already loose, scattered like embers on dry hay. People were watching. People were listening. and some were riding them down. The fight spilled toward the riverbank. Snow crunched, lanterns swung wildly. Violet's cries pierced the night as Richter dragged her, his breath harsh, his fury barely contained. Heinrich broke free for an instant, lunging forward, but was clubbed to the ground. Greta's wail split the air, desperate, animal. Violet clawed at Richter's hand, but her voice still forced its way through. You cannot bury it. The river won't keep your secrets. Richter's face twisted. He glanced at the crowd forming at the edge of the depot, whispers rising like a tide. The constable was pushing through now, but too far, too slow. In that moment, Richter made his choice. With a savage jerk, he swung Violet up, her small frame no heavier to him than a sack of grain. She kicked, gasping, eyes wide, voice cracking into one last shout. They will know, Hans. They will know what you did. And then he hurled her into the black churn of the river. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The snow muffled everything. Then Greta screamed, a sound so raw it tore through the station. Heinrich scrambled toward the edge, plunging into the icy water without hesitation. Wilhelm staggered forward, reaching. The river swallowed Violet. The current was fast, the night merciless. Heinrich thrashed in the dark water, calling her name, his voice breaking, swallowed by the roar of the current. Greta fell to her knees, clutching her face, rocking. On the platform, bystanders erupted into chaos, some shouting for the constable, others rushing to the edge, others frozen in horror. And Father O'Brien, who had arrived too late, stood stricken. He had run to meet them, journals clutched under his arm, but all he could do was watch as the child he had sworn to protect vanished beneath the river's skin. Richter did not flee. He stood tall, chest heaving, coat flaring in the wind. His eyes swept the crowd, daring them to speak, daring them to accuse. But the air was different now. The silence was not protection anymore. It was witness. One by one, people turned their eyes on him, not in fear, but in recognition. They had heard Violet's words. They had seen his violence. The ledger of secrets he had hidden for years now bled into the open. The constable reached him, hand on his pistol, voice tight with command. Hans Richter, you'll come with me. Richter's lips curled in disdain, but for the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes. Heinrich staggered from the river, empty-handed, drenched, broken. His face was white with shock, eyes hollow. Greta collapsed against him, sobbing. Father O'Brien dropped to his knees beside them, clutching the journals to his chest as though they were the child herself. She spoke the truth, he whispered, voice shaking. Every word. And I have it all here. She cannot be silenced. His words fell heavy in the frozen night. The river rushed on, carrying Violet's small body away, but her voice lingered, echoing in memory, in whispers, in ink scratched into leather-bound pages. And for the first time, the ward trembled not under Richter's shadow, but under the weight of a child's truth. The river kept her. All night men searched with lanterns and poles, their breath rising in white plumes against the dark. Heinrich waited until his legs numbed and buckled, Greta calling his name from the shore, her cries ragged and breaking. But the water gave nothing back. By dawn, only silence remained. The current rolled on, indifferent, carrying secrets away. In the days that followed, the Third Ward held its breath. The depot confrontation could not be undone. Too many had heard Violet's words. Too many had seen her seized. Too many had watched her body vanish beneath the river. Fear still gripped the streets, but it was a different kind of fear now, not of Violet, but of the men she had named. Whispers turned to accusations, accusations to questions, and questions, at last, to investigations. Father O'Brien took his journals to the police, his hands trembling as he handed them over. It was an act that tore something holy inside him, but he no longer cared. The seal of confession had been broken long before, broken by necessity, by the burden that had crushed a child. Detective Michael Donahue opened the first journal with wary eyes. What he found inside shocked him. Pages filled with names, places, methods, crimes described with a clarity no priest could have fabricated. It was a ledger of sin, written in the hand of a man desperate to preserve a child's truth. This is enough to start, Donahue said grimly. God help us, it may be more than enough. O'Brien only bowed his head, murmuring a prayer for Violet's soul. The ward erupted in waves. Woolmer's old tavern was raided. Shackles and stained beams were pulled from the cellar and carried into daylight. Ledgers hidden beneath floorboards revealed payouts, shipments, bribes. Families came forward with stories of missing sons and daughters, stories long dismissed as runaways or accidents. Each revelation added weight to Violet's words. Each discovery confirmed that she had spoken truth. And Hans Richter? He was arrested that night, but by morning he was gone. The guards claimed he had slipped away in the confusion. Some whispered he had bribed his release. Others insisted the network that once obeyed him had turned and swallowed him whole. What mattered was that his shadow no longer loomed in the streets of Milwaukee. But justice, even partial, came at a cost. Hinrich never recovered. He walked the riverbanks daily, staring into the current as if expecting Violet to climb from the water, braids dripping, eyes pale as before. Greta withered quickly, her grief turning inward until her body broke. By spring, she was buried in Holy Trinity Cemetery, her grave marked with a simple wooden cross. Hinrich lived longer, but his eyes never softened again. He worked, drank, searched, always searching, until one morning, his body was found slumped against the river's edge, his boots half in the water, his face turned toward the place where Violet had disappeared. The ward buried him beside Greta, the two graves lying side by side beneath the heavy oak. Father O'Brien grew older with a stoop in his back and an unshakable heaviness in his eyes. He continued to serve the parish, but he was never the same priest. The journals he had kept remained with the police, yet he always carried one fragment of Violet's memory with him, a slip of paper she had once scrawled on, a list of words she could not keep inside. He read it in the quiet hours, whispering her name as penance, as prayer. Near the end of his life, he convinced the parish council to place a plaque at St. Michael's. A small bronze tablet, affixed near the confessional, engraved with a single line, in memory of Violet Mueller, whose truth could not be silenced. Parishioners touched it when they passed, some with reverence, some with unease. Children asked about it, and the answers were always hushed, incomplete. But the plaque stood, a wound made permanent in metal. Years later, long after O'Brien had been buried, the ward changed. The tenements gave way to factories, factories to warehouses, warehouses to new streets and new immigrants. The memory of Violet thinned, as memories do, surviving only in old records, in whispered tales told by grandmothers who remembered being children when the girl spoke too much. But in 1923, when demolition crews tore down what remained of Woolmer's Tavern, they found a sealed compartment in the basement wall. Inside, crates of papers, ledgers, letters, and contracts that mapped an entire network of trafficking, bribery, and violence. Names appeared again, names Violet had spoken decades before. The papers were taken to the police. Historians studied them, reformers cited them, prosecutors used them to argue for stronger protections for witnesses and stricter oversight of immigrant wards. It was proof, at last, that the girl who had drowned in the Milwaukee River had spoken only the truth. But proof could not give her back. Her name remained on the plaque. Her story became a cautionary tale for priests, for parents, for anyone tempted to burden a child with what they could not possibly bear. And for those who believed in saints and martyrs, Violet's memory carried something more, a sense that her small life had shifted the course of justice in ways no adult could have. Sometimes, on winter nights when the river froze along its edges and the bells of St. Michael's tolled across the ward, old men swore they heard a child's voice in the wind. Not laughter, not singing, but whispering. Whispering names. Whispering secrets no one else dared keep. The story of Violet Mueller did not end in water. It lingered in ink, in whispers, in stone and bronze. It lingered in the silence broken at a train depot, in the shame carried by men who could no longer bury their sins. And in that way, Violet lived on, not as the girl who drowned, but as the girl who could not forget. The river kept her body, but her voice belonged to the world. And once it was spoken, it could never be taken back. He won.